Alfonso Light. Gets ang lasang hanap mo. Drink responsibly.
So welcome po sa inyong lahat pati sa mga kasama natin virtually.
Gusto kong lumahok sa pagka-vice-presidente.
Andito kami para supportahan mo!
Kung ano yung meron kami, meron din yung mga nagtatrabaho sa amin.
Yung public servant thinks of the nation and the next generation. Yung politician thinks of himself and the next election.
Katapangan, kakayahan, at katapatan para mamuno sa ating bayan.
Ako po ay humaharap sa inyo upang hingin ang inyong tiwala. Hindi biro-biro ang mga pagsubok na haharapin ng susunod na administrasyon. Kailangan na natin tumugon. Kailangan nating umaksyon.
Mayroon kaming sapat na kakayahan, katapatan at katapangan upang pamunuan ng ating bansa at upang muling bumangon sa ating pagkakalugmok.
Ito na ang simula.
Para sa ating inang bayan.
On the morning of December 7th, 1941, 353 Japanese planes would attack Pearl Harbor, the American naval base at Hawaii. 2,403 American lives would perish in the attack, with 19 ships and 188 aircraft being destroyed or damaged in the process. Although the attack was a complete surprise for the American public, the assault on Pearl Harbor was far from being a random attack on an unsuspecting enemy. The operation had been meticulously planned for months, with the causes behind it stemming back years. After the Great War, Japan had emerged as a victor state, but had agreed to respect Chinese territorial sovereignty, as well as agreeing to limit their naval capacity to 3/5 the size of British and American fleets. Japanese naval officers, however, resented the restrictions imposed on their fleet at the Washington Naval Conference in 1921. In the West, prejudice against Asian countries was commonplace, with them being seen as places to be colonized by European powers and siphoned of their natural resources. So although Japan, a small island nation, was sitting amongst the greatest industrial powers of the age, Japanese resentment began to build to what they saw as Western arrogance. Not only was Japan's sentiment towards international relations deteriorating, but Japan had also experienced a population boom, with overcrowding and poverty emerging in the growth. Coupled with the Great Depression, many nationalist sentiments began to rise, with military leaders beginning to believe that Japan's future could only be secured through outward expansion, a military conquest to secure new land, oil, raw materials and grain. If Japan could successfully seize new territories, they would be in a position to become a great world power. And so in 1931, Japan staged a railway incident in a northern part of China named Manchuria, claiming the Chinese had destroyed Japanese railway tracks. In response, Japan took over the entire province. The new land would be called Manchukuo, a puppet state controlled by Imperial Japan. Japan's actions brought about international condemnation, with the League of Nations calling for Japanese withdrawal from Manchuria. In response, Japan left the League of Nations, which had once again proven ineffective. Japan would go on, further expanding into China, and by the end of 1937 had seized Shanghai and the city of Nanking. In what later became known as the Rape of Nanking, the Japanese participated in the destruction, widespread slaughter, rape and murder of innocent civilians. 200,000 innocent lives would be taken in less than 6 weeks. International outrage and condemnation of Japanese actions would become the norm, with the United States government giving the Chinese a loan of $25 million to aid in resisting the Japanese invasion. By July 1940, a new leadership had emerged in Japan, with the Ministry of War being spearheaded by a man named Hideki Tojo. Tojo put military expansion as Japan's main goal, pursuing the conquest of Asia and the Pacific. With the Western Allies weakened by German blitzkrieg, Japan looked to the south, to French Indochina, to the Dutch East Indies and to British Malaya, all of which were ripe for the taking. This move to the south would provide Japan with raw materials, oil and rubber, but risked provoking a war with the West, especially the United States, who had bases in the Philippines. US President Franklin Roosevelt was unsettled by rising fascist powers around the globe and had a desire to step in. But the American people were deeply isolationist. After fighting in the Great War, the American people were reluctant to enter another, with most being unaffected by conflicts happening across the sea. Even with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill petitioning America for help, few were willing to get involved. Yet Roosevelt saw things differently. He believed that letting Britain and France fall to a German invasion, which would wipe out Western democracy.
Let's unbox my new phone mula sa Palengke Place.
Gusto mo ng legit? Legit sa Last Mall or get twice your money back. Click on the Last Mall icon and add to cart. Basta legit? Legit sa Last Mall. Sure ka sa Lazada.
Democracy in Europe would come to have disastrous consequences for the United States. And so while he refused to intervene with force, Roosevelt did everything he could to help the Allies with aid, sending American ships into British ports, filled with essential supplies vital for the war effort. In the East, however, a different plan was taken. America's Pacific Fleet was relocated to Pearl Harbor, an American naval base in Hawaii. With American power now stationed closer to Japan, Roosevelt hoped that it would deter Japanese aggression, with the island nation having to consider its actions more carefully before attacking Allied colonies. But deterrence proved ineffective, with Japan going on to invade French Indochina. Roosevelt responded with economic sanctions, placing an embargo on important naval and aviation supplies to Japan, such as oil, iron ore, steel and rubber. Great Britain and the Netherlands soon followed, with Japan finding itself cut off from 90% of its oil supply. As Japan relied on importing oil, with this resource now cut off, their dreams of empire were now out of reach. Japan was left with three options: back down and forever live in the shadow of Western powers, try and negotiate a deal, or double down and find a new source of oil through conquest. Turning first to negotiation, Japan offered to withdraw from Indochina and parts of the Chinese mainland, but only if the United States would re-establish trade relations as well as support a Japanese acquisition of the Dutch East Indies. The Roosevelt administration rejected the proposals and demanded outright Japanese withdrawal from China. Japan was furious, and the very same day their proposal was rejected, they set sail to an American naval base in Hawaii, a place that went by the name of Pearl Harbor. Mussolini came to power in 1922 and wanted to restore Italy's greatness. His plan was to create a new Roman Empire, but he did not yet have the economic or military capability to do so. In 1935, Mussolini had aligned with Britain and France, opposing plans for German rearmament, but that same year, Italy also invaded Abyssinia, modern-day Ethiopia. Abyssinia was a member of the League of Nations and appealed for international help. The British and French, in response, placed economic sanctions on Italy, although they were more symbolic than effective. Even so, Mussolini now regarded Britain and France as enemies. 5 years later, in 1940, as France was falling to German blitzkrieg, Mussolini saw his chance and decided to join the side of Hitler and the Nazis. With his new ally, Mussolini's dreams of empire had come closer, and he was now in prime position to seize the British and French territories of the Mediterranean and North Africa. Mussolini's eyes now laid upon Egypt, but there was a problem. Churchill was an enthusiastic imperialist and believed that control of the Mediterranean was vital to Britain's interests. Britain controlled both the Suez Canal and the Straits of Gibraltar, the waterways connecting the Mediterranean to the Indian and Atlantic Oceans. The British colony of Egypt was also pivotal to the British Empire. On the coastline of Egypt lay the Suez Canal, which linked Britain to India, Australia and the Far East, as well as the oil fields of Iraq, Syria and Iran. The canal also facilitated Britain with supplies from the Empire that were vital to the war effort, including oil and food, of which over half were imported. The loss of the Suez Canal would add several weeks to voyages to the east and expose redirected British ships to German U-boats in the Atlantic. The safety and welfare of Britain and its empire would therefore reside directly with Egypt. The fate of Britain lay in the sand. But Mussolini planned to capture Egypt, from which he could threaten British naval bases in the Mediterranean, as well as the Suez Canal. And from Mussolini's perspective, he had good reason to think he would be successful. In June 1939, the British Mediterranean fleet had only 45 combat ships against Italy's 183. The Italians also had more submarines, with 108 against Britain's 12. And with France surrendering in June 1940, the entire weight of controlling the Mediterranean Sea would reside with the Royal Navy. On land, the odds were also in Italy's favour. Italy had some 250,000 troops in Libya, with the British only having 100,000 troops, stretched out to defend Egypt, Sudan and Palestine. On the 11th of June 1940, Benito Mussolini declared war on Britain and France, and on September 13th, the Italian 10th Army invaded Egypt from their colony Libya. The Italians invaded quickly and soon captured the coastal town of Sidi Barrani. Archibald Wavell, Commander-in-Chief of the Middle East, began to plan a counterattack, which was codenamed Operation Compass. Wavell would send the Western Desert Force, comprised of 36,000 men from Britain, India, Australia and New Zealand. But rather than attacking where the Italians suspected, in December 1940, the Western Desert Force swung south, travelling across the open desert to attack the Italian forces from behind. Wavell's plan had worked, with Italian defences being overrun in a matter of days. In the Battle of Sidi Barrani, the British had managed to capture 40,000 Italian soldiers, with the remainder fleeing west. Italy's hopes of empire were looking unlikely. But for the Italians it only got worse. Losses would continue, with the British chasing the fleeing troops 500 miles across Libya, with the British going on to capture Bardia, Tobruk, Derna and Benghazi. Wavell's offensive would finally end at El Agheila on the 7th of February 1941. The Italians had nowhere else to run. In just 2 months, the British had destroyed 10 Italian divisions and captured more than 130,000 prisoners. Churchill, confident that North Africa was now under British control, would send a large part of the region's forces to fight in Greece. In April 1939, Mussolini took the first steps towards creating his new empire, occupying Albania to the east. Over a year later, in October 1940, Mussolini marched south into Greece after they refused to become an Italian colony. However, despite Italy's superior numbers, almost double that of the Greeks, they failed to take the country, being pushed out of Greece and much of Albania too. Seeing this as an opportunity to cripple Axis control in the area, Churchill was quick to send aid, diverting British soldiers from North Africa to help the Greeks defend their country and push back Italy. Unfortunately for the Allies, this drew the attention of Hitler, who would not allow his southern flank to become exposed. In April 1941, Hitler sent 500,000 German soldiers southward, quickly overcoming the combined British and Greek forces. Within a month,